I do think you'll experience different levels of new information depending upon where you are on your academic journey. We were joking the first night. You had mentioned that too many things have been published, and yet my assignment was to talk to them about getting published. So let's for a moment just think that it might be good to publish some things that might be helpful. But I totally understand that you'll be at different stages and different phases. So for a little background on me, I am the dean of the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. I have done. I'm primarily a popular writer and speaker. Popular doesn't mean like millions of people listen to you. It means like that's in contrast to academic. So that's probably, most of my books are more popular books. I've written a couple of textbooks. I contributed to a Rutledge handbook recently that they sell one chapter, but they sell the book for $240. So that's, you're writing in academic space when nobody buys the book. That's the sign, is that you publish something in a chapter that nobody will ever buy, unless the libraries buy it. That's their audience. They sell it to libraries because it's one of those Rutledge handbooks. So the journal articles, I'll talk some about journal articles as well, and sort of unpack what it looks like to write in that space. It's a little tricky to. So let me explain. Part of what you have to decide to do when you talk about something like this is, do you use some examples of things you've written? And the upside of that is that you can kind of explain your thinking process and why you went that way and why you might consider a similar process, even though the topics will be very different. But the other side of that is that people sometimes say, well, you talk too much about yourself. And so it's always kind of a risk. The Brits don't do that. They don't talk about things that they write, but it's different in different contexts. So I'm going to share a couple of things about when I started academic writing, and just use some examples to help you think about how to write on certain topics. So if that's culturally different in your context, it would be very appropriate in my context, but I like to think we're a multicultural context, and we can kind of learn, even though we might have done it differently where we are. Okay, so academic writing is of course, writing is writing in a sense, but academic writing, we're gonna have we're gonna talk some about specific expectations of academic writing and how that ultimately works. What are the different kinds of writing? How do we engage in it? What's the value in it? Now, I've been a tenured faculty member at what's probably academically the leading Christian university in America. Christian university is a different vibe from other countries. But having gone through the tenure track process at Wheaton College and becoming a tenure track professor, I had to meet certain qualifications, and not just popular writing, but certain qualifications in order to do that. Now I'm a dean, and deans don't have tenure. They can fire a dean anytime they're bored. And that's okay. But as a dean, I actually was a tenured professor at Wheaton College before I became a dean at Wheaton College, and that makes it a little more complicated. They can't get rid of you as easily. But when you think about academic writing, to just give an example of my own journey. So I have written, the first article I ever wrote was for a periodical, basically a newspaper of a denominational district. And the article was in the Baptist New Mexican. I'm a Baptist like Jesus and all the disciples were. Is that okay to joke? Just checking. Is that okay to make that joke? Just making sure how easily offended you are. And so I wrote on something that I knew. And so I wrote an article. I was a church planter. I was a church planter in Buffalo, New York, maybe by that time in Erie, Pennsylvania. And I happened to know the guy who was the editor of the paper. His name was Gus Suarez. And he said, hey, you planted a couple churches now. Why don't you write on it? I said, okay. So I wrote this popular level. I'm going to say maybe popular level is a better way to put it, because again, it's a little teeny magazine of a few hundred churches. I still have the first copy. It's the first thing I ever published. And I got a good response from it. But I want you to notice a couple things, right? I wrote in an area that I knew, right? I wrote in an area that I was passionate about. And I wrote in an area where people were interested. So that became a pattern that I would use when I stepped into academic writing as well. But let's look first at some of the things, some types of academic writing, okay? And in kind of and I've got the sources here from because of course we're going to cite our sources in academia, right? So the four typical ways to analyze or to write academically are descriptive, analytical, persuasive, and critical. And those are probably, those words probably make sense to you. It doesn't need a lot of elaboration, but we'll take just a little bit here. So the descriptive is something that you're going to actually describe a situation as is. Now, you can branch that out into all different kinds. I mean, you could do ethno-linguistic people studies. That's my field's missiology, and that's descriptive of the mores, the taboos, the cultural context of a certain ethno-linguistic people group. You could do it on the Pokot in Africa, the Quechua of the highlands in Peru. Analytical is obviously the word analyze, or you're looking at something. You might be saying, a good book review will be analytical in many ways, could be critical in many ways as well. Persuasive might be trying to change people's mind on something. So I contributed to an academic textbook on mission. Remember, I'm a missiologist, so I'm not a pathologist. I'm not a physicist. So all of my examples are going to be in the field in which I wrote. So it was in a 5 views book. So sometimes in scholarly writing, you end up contrasting with one another. So I was asked to participate in a 5 views book, a 5 views of mission. Craig Ott was the editor. Some of you may know Craig Ott from his long-term ministry in Germany and beyond. And so there were 5 views. One was Catholic. Stephen Bevins was Catholic missiologist. Raman was the Eastern Orthodox missiologist. We had Daryl Guter, kind of the conciliar, mainline. Conciliar is probably more the European. You can think of the World Council of Churches world. Ruth Padilla DeBorst was more of a progressive evangelical, and I guess I was just the old school evangelical. I called it a kingdom mission view. And so my job was to persuade and also to critique. There's some critical analysis there as well, but that was primarily persuasive. So you can write academically. It's a little less common, but you can write academically and have kind of a persuasive approach to that. And then critical is where you're going to have an analysis, a critical analysis of, so it takes it a little bit deeper. But that being said, there's a few things. I'm going to try to give you a few examples. So my first academic piece of writing, I want you to see the trajectory of the writing, right? So my first academic piece of writing, remember my very first article was on why start churches in the Baptist New Mexican. And then over time, I wasn't a scholar at that time. I would later, write more academically. I didn't have a PhD at that time. I don't think I had a doctor of ministry at that time. So I did a doctor of ministry, which helped me be a better writer, but maybe not academic writing. Then I did the PhD. And I think it was during the time of the PhD, I'm sharing this little biography on purpose. So I came to Christ in the charismatic movement of the Anglican tradition. Okay, so think of like HTB. I was HTB before HTB was HTB, right? So that's where I came to Christ. The charismatic movement, kind of swept through the Episcopal Church where I was. And so I was kind of fascinated because by this time I was in a Baptist church, and we don't do those things, right? You get too excited, people ask you to leave the church and go to the Pentecostal church down the road. So, but I still believed in all the spiritual gifts. And so what has it got to do with academics? Stay with me. But by now I'm starting to study eras of mission. Hans Kung would call them epochs of mission. And Hans Kung would talk specifically about the apocalyptic paradigm of mission, which would be the early few centuries of the church. And he would speak to, and Eusebius would even write about this, the great historian Eusebius, and he would say that there seemed to be this time when there was a lot more activity supernaturally than there. Eusebius says we no longer see it in our day, but we could see it in the records that something was going on then. Pentecostals would say that there's in some way a restoration of that in maybe the latter rain, starting with the beginning of the Pentecostal movement. So I wanted to know, well, what happened? And so I'm church planter, right? So I've got this charismatic background and bent still. I'm interested I start reading a little bit through a few people like Houston and some others like von Kampenhausen. And I'm like, oh, this is really interesting. So there's something that goes on after the New Testament, but before the rise of what von Kampenhausen calls the monarchical episcopate. You know the word monarch, you know the word episcopate. In other words, the bishop as the ruler. And so von Kampenhausen writes a little bit about it, and I'm interested in the early church. I'm interested in patristics. I've already been aware of something called the Didache or the Shepherd of Hermas and other documents. And so I decide to take my interest. What's my interest? I'm a church planter. I'm now a new academic writer. I've got a charismatic background, but not functionally much of a charismatic practicing at that time. I want to know what's going on in the early church. And so I look for something that's sort of an underwritten upon era. Actually, some people say that, many people actually said, scholars would say that there's not been a lot of research done on this. And I write my first journal article on the wandering ecstatic prophet in the missionary practice of the sub-apostolic church. It sounded a lot more exciting than why start churches, right? That was my first popular article. So the wandering ecstatic prophet, which it's very niche-y, but if you look at the beginning of the New Testament, there's not a lot of prophets. But by the time you get to the older books in the New Testament, there's false prophets, there's these people prophesying, there's all this kind of prophesying going on. I think Wayne Grudem's book on prophecy in 1 Corinthians and Today was in and out about that time. I should tell you that John Wimber was an influence in my life. He'd laid hands on me, given me the prophetic word. So you can see, okay, so I'm interested in this stuff. So then I start digging deep. And once you begin to dig deep into some of those things, that's when some of the writing. So I actually made a persuasive case of the wandering ecstatic practice was often overlooked in the sub-apostolic, so think like past the 70s and beyond. And von Kampenhausen writes a whole book, but I got to go some primary sources, which is really good when you're doing these kinds of things. And what I pointed to is that there's this whole period before the final rise of the monarchical episcopate when sort of those wandering ecstatic prophets, but you read the Didache, there's all kinds of rules about prophets. You can only stay this long, you can only take this much. So why is the Didache, which is perhaps older, we don't know for sure, but perhaps older than the book of Revelation, talking about all these prophets, which also talks about prophets in the book of Revelation. So why is that the case? So that was the case I made. Now, I will tell you that originally, in the first draft, I kind of wanted to be a little bit more like, and what should we think about this today? But I didn't. I kind of left that part out because I wanted to stay on the persuasive of that specific thing. Because part of it is to, when you write, is you're going to be utilizing a formal, cautious, and objective approach. So I had interest in the topic. That's what brought me to the table. So that's where, for me, Why Start Churches, my first popular article, when the first academic article really, I was making the case, I was persuading that we've kind of lost this part of, not lost, because people had written on it, but maybe we have, Ian Houston had written on it, maybe we had de-emphasized this part of it. So that was my case. And I actually ended my article with some variant of more research needs to be done, which, by the way, is a great way to end every single article that you write. More research needs to be done. There's always more research needs to be done. So one of the most noticeable stylistic aspects of academic communication is the tendency for writers to avoid expressing absolute certainty where there may be a small degree of uncertainty and to avoid making overgeneralizations where a small number of exceptions might exist. So, for example, I spend, now as I grade dissertations, new writers, oftentimes when people are writing their PhD dissertation, they're new. And so they make totalizing statements all the time. And so much of my life is saying, you need to caveat this. You need to caveat this. A lot of red markings I printed out on paper because I like the bleeding red all over it. And I tell them, I'm serving you well by making you make your case better. That's part of the academic supervisor role. Actually, I'll tell you a true story. When I was doing my PhD, we had a colloquium. We're supposed to sort of go around the circle and critique one another's paper. And I was assigned to critique someone's paper, and someone was assigned to critique mine. And in Christian environments, sometimes people really don't do well on this because they always want to encourage the person. And I want you to encourage the person, but the best way you can encourage the person is to help a person be a better writer. So I happened to be the first person up in the colloquium when I was doing my PhD work. And they kind of described it. You'd have to figure out how you weren't there. But for example, I went through, and this is a PhD level, and I said, using this source is totally inappropriate in a PhD level. It's not close to PhD level, et cetera, et cetera. So I went through, and it was funny because it kind of changed the tone of the room, and then everybody got brutal afterwards, including the person who critiqued me. But that's how you get to be a better academic writer. So again, if you go to a program that everyone's nice, you actually might end up being not served well. Because again, you want to work towards utilizing a formal, cautious, and objective approach. Now, sometimes in doing so, you'll actually find that, the way I phrase is the purpose of academic writing is to communicate complex issues in a way that makes them least likely to be challenged. So again, it's important to avoid any ambiguity. That means academic writing must be things like formal, structured, precise. So let me give you another example. So eventually my work evolved, and I wasn't writing about history. I was writing more about missiology in general. The problem with missiology is a very broad field, and you can be 100 different things and be writing a missiology. So in America, there is a statistical construct called the General Social Survey. Canada does the best religion research on its population in the world. Canada does. They ask religious questions on the census. The U.S. doesn't ask religious questions on the census. Other countries do, but for us, it comes back to those founding documents, and you can't ask about religion. So religion research in America has generally fallen to something called the General Social Survey. And if you're American and you've done any sociology, you have worked with the General Social Survey. It asks religious questions. And it's the most popularly quoted source of research in America today. So it uses something called, because it just asks questions. And to ask questions, you got to sort people by asking questions. I'm going to give you an example in just a minute. The General Social Survey, people ask religion questions, but it also asks them like 100 other questions. Do you like baseball? That's not one of them, but do you like baseball? And wait, you're a Presbyterian. Presbyterians like baseball more than anybody else. You can actually make things like that work. But to do that, you have to sort kind of the kinds of Christians in America. Now, if I ask you, are you a Christian? People say yes, about 66, depending on the survey, 66% of Americans say yes to that question. Now, is there anybody who's an American here? Any Americans? All right, you're American. You're an American. But I thought you were living. All right, but of the word. And where are you? Where do you live? You live in Naperville. Okay, can I call on you with some questions?
You may.
You could say no.
Not from the academia.
No, it's totally not going to be academia. Stay with me. What is your name?
Steve.
Steve, where do you go to church?
Compass.
I'll be preaching for you in August.
Okay.
I don't know if you knew that. Yeah.
I'll see you again.
I'll see your pastor. We're going to the ball game next week. Okay, so Steve, I'm going to call you up, and because I know your denomination, but that's not the. So I'm going to call you up and say, "You ring, ring, ring." It's a phone. It's this phone survey. Steve, we got you 10 questions. Steve, are you a Christian?
Yes.
Do you go to church?
Yes.
Okay. What kind of church do you go to?
Evangelical.
What kind of evangelical? Do you know?
You know what? I don't.
It's okay. A lot of people don't, which is part of the challenge. You're evangelical free. Your church is affiliated with the Evangelical Free Church.
I got that.
But you said evangelical.
I thought you were looking for something.
No, but when you said evangelical, that doesn't mean evangelical free, because it could be evangelical covenant. Okay, no, good. Okay, so same thing for you. Where do you go to church when you're in America? Okay, you would say Anglican, and I would say what kind of Anglican?
Evangelical.
Okay, and they might say, but that's its descriptor. So I only have a list of denominations. Are you in
Anglican Church of North America?
Which is in the list? Okay, so here's the example. Okay, in the General Social Survey, you ask what denomination are you, and you write down Anglican Church in North America. But you could have said Episcopal Church. The answers to a survey are very different from somebody who goes to an Episcopal church. So the General Social Survey has a sorting construct that sits on top of it called the RELTRAD, Religious Traditions. So both of you would be sorted. You would actually not have been listed E-free, because you probably would have said evangelical, and they would put you in a generic evangelical. So these surveys are not perfect. You would have been pressed, and you would be ACNA, so you would be listed as in the evangelical bucket. There's evangelical, mainline. It's not the same word we use in Europe, but it's like the old state church and Lutherans, things of that sort. And then there's Catholic, and then there's Mormon, and then there's Black Protestant, okay? So you have these categories, right? But let's say for just a minute you said Episcopal. You'd be sorted into a different one. Now, most active Christians, not most, the largest group of active Christians today who active in church, the largest group is actually non-denominational evangelicals. So when you would answer the first time, they would have heard a lot, and they would just put you in that category of non-denominational evangelical if they didn't press you on it. But evangelical free, you knew. Matter of fact, the most important word in evangelical free is free. So they don't have to say they're a part of anything because they're free. You, on the other hand, have to be canonically resident under a bishop, and that's a whole different thing. Okay, so why does that matter? Stay with me on research. So I'm doing research now using the REL-TRAD over the General Social Survey, and I'm a little surprised that the number of evangelicals keeps sort of being less than I thought it should be. Not because I'd like to see more evangelicals, but something seems to be wrong. So I have a research team, and I say to Daniel on my research team, hey, let's figure, I need you to get the code. So the code is stored at the University of Indiana. The code was put together by a group of scholars. You can actually look up REL-TRAD. They wrote a description for it. They described their coding system and everything else. So the code, I like the coding system. I use it. It's my number one go-to coding system. But we go to the University of Indiana, we download the code, we seek to replicate the code using our own system in SPSS or Stata, and what we find is that it's broken. So everybody who's using the most popular religious survey tool on American Christians for, I think it was 7 years, the code was missing one field. When you put non-denominational evangelical, it dropped it and didn't count it. That's the fastest growing category in religion. So everybody who wrote their PhD dissertation for over those 7 years, if they were doing anything on evangelicals, all of them were wrong. So we're like, we found this. Well, I will tell you, I'm interested in the topic. Now I'm not a statistician. I hire statisticians. I had 2 statisticians who work for me. But so Ryan Burge, who has since become pretty famous in stats, and he's writing books, et cetera, et cetera. So Ryan Burge and I are talking. Ryan Burge had written his, Burge, not Bird. He had written his PhD dissertation using the REL-TRAD, and he's graduated, and now it's all broken. So he and I together write an article for the Journal of Politics and Religion. It's a Cambridge-hosted journal. And we paid, it's called, I'm trying to remember the type of articles, different types of articles in their journals. And we write a notice, if you will, and kind of share that. And people got pretty upset. Everyone's like, no, and then they recreate, oh, yeah, it is. And so then we had to create a new repository of it. Now here's the thing. It's something I was interested in. It's something that really helped. I can tell you that's probably the most widely read thing in the nerd world, and I like the nerd world, in the nerd world on statistical research that I've ever done. So what did we do? Now, there was no glee in that. It was formal. We wanted to point out that something's broken in the code. And because we could have said, Ryan's dissertation, now mind you, they don't take away your dissertation when the code was broken. You can just recalculate the things that were there. But Ryan could be upset. I could be like, I'm glad I discovered this, but no, formal, structured. Okay, so we needed to produce an unambiguous statement. Here was the unambiguous statement. The missing code was only for, so you were still counted, but you were probably not counted because you just said evangelical. So non-denominational evangelical, which is the fastest growing category in practicing religion in America today, was dropped for 7 years. And so it would have been going ding, 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 and it didn't. But we had to make that case. We had to show. We had to get up and point out and more. Be precise. People were mad. In hindsight, we said that when we brought to the attention of the people who held the code at the University of Indiana, we wrote in the note that the code had been removed from the University of Indiana site without notice or without mention. And we didn't mean that in a critical way. It was actually a very precise way. But they took it as you were like shaming us. So we apologize. That wasn't our intent at all. Our intent was to say, the code's gone, and there's no note that says all the code was bad for the last 7 years, and you need a note that says the code was bad. And so by our publishing it in that journal, we helped to get the word out, because so if you're relying on PhD dissertation that use the REL-TRAD that sits on top of the GSS, so kind of burning out, so it's appropriate, it was to communicate the audience in its most effective way. Very different. I'm a missiologist. Now I'm writing a statistical analysis of a broken code from a construct that sits on top of the General Social Survey. So I actually co-authored that with Ryan, who is a statistician of religion, and we worked on that together.
What
Okay.
year was that?
No, I don't remember. 5, 6 years ago? Did you write your dissertation?
No.
Because that was,
Curious.
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Just if you Google my name, just Stetzer and Reltrad, you'll find the article goes up. It's widely cited. But again, it was the way we had to communicate it fit within that formal, cautious, and objective approach. We did inform them as soon as we saw, but then the article was mostly written, the note, I think they call it, in that particular journal. Okay, so then you'll learn the writing conventions. Academic writing is defined by conventions rather than rules. That's probably an important reality. This means they're flexible and adaptable at least some of the time. And so this is where it gets a little tricky based upon your field. I had to make a decision in preparing this, is that I have a field. So I don't know the conventions in physics. I don't know how to write an academic paper in physics. But some of the convention things, examples would include discriminate towards the active voice and away from the passive. This is, again, inexperienced writers, a lot of time things are happening to rather than things are happening. And so we want to push away from the passive towards an active voice. The economy of words is to be preferred. This avoids repetition, shorter, concise sentences trump longer sentences. That said, don't write choppy sentences simply for brevity. But to be clear, there's a whole field that if you just put in, we call this, when we're grading a paper, we call this a word salad. So if you sort of put in a word salad with all the jingoistic terms, and there were actually some hoaxsters who submitted some academic papers to journals with basically using word salad, and they were actually published by some of those journals. So in some cases, the emperor has no clothes when it comes to academic writing, because if you step into a jingoistic sort of repetitious pattern, those are certain fields, and in most fields you can't do that. So economy of words matters. Avoid informal vocabulary, so like contractions. So generally, I mean, no one's going to like scream at you, but just if you avoid writing contractions, any colloquialism, I think in terms too of if you're writing in English or whatever your language is, that somebody from another language should be able to read it without knowing the colloquialisms, right? That, you know, something that is kind of local to you or to your context. Cliches for sure. Now again, that's very different. So I'm the editor of a magazine now. I'm the editor of Outreach magazine. So it's one of the few print magazines left in America that talks about faith and things of that sort. And I actually follow a very different set of rules when I'm there. Like I'll start a sentence and I'll even end a sentence with I'll start a sentence with "and" sometimes. And here we go again. You know, I would never write academically for that. And so I have editors. If you don't have editors, editors are the best ever. I've got editors. I would never send a popular article to my academic editor named Jason, and he would be terrible. And I would never send an academic article to one of my popular editors like Jonathan or Laura. But in doing so, you recognize that there are conventions in that space, and sometimes it's hard to go back and forth. Trend towards formal and away from the language of everyday communication. Avoid intense or emotionally evaluative language. And again, probably when I do, and this is the difference too, it's not true around the world. Not everyone has DMins and PhDs, but DMins and PhDs to me are kind of a fascinating contrast. A Doctor of Ministry is a practical ministry degree. It's a terminal degree. It's intended to be generally for pastors and ministry leaders. We offer a DMin at Talbot. We have, I don't even know, like 300 students. And I have a DMin. I did a DMin before I did my PhD. And it helped me to kind of think about the difference between those two types of writings, right? So in the DMin, you know, I mean, I wrote about my desire for my church that I'm writing this project on to experience this transformation. And that was one helpful way to do it as a DMin. I think it was a fine DMin. For the PhD, I did a statistical analysis. So obviously I picked up statistics a little later on. Not a statistician, but one of my languages, you have to take languages, well, now they're dropping a lot of the languages, but one of my languages in my PhD was actually in the area of stats. And so then I did this study, and it was very much an analytical study. It was just, this is what happens when this happened across 4 years using these crosstabs, these things, using our Cronbach alphas, doing regression analysis, those sorts of things. So the difference is, I think, an important distinction between the two. And use first person sparingly, if at all, but I want you to know that for a lot of people for a long time, you could never use first person. Matter of fact, there may be two things that you learned that are no longer true. One is that you have to put 2 periods after every sentence, depending how old you are. You might have been putting 2 periods after every sentence. That's not true anymore. And I can always tell a new student who comes in who's over 45, because if they're coming back to school after a long time, there's 2 periods after every sentence. You did that on a typewriter so that you would separate the two. You never did that? Then you never had that experience, 2 periods? Okay. Anybody? Okay, here you go.
Well, I want to ask you, are you talking about 2 periods or 2 spaces?
Spaces. Thank you. Why did I say space? Thank you. All right. Does that make more sense? 2 spaces? You did that? Yeah. So my age, you too. And it's hard to stop. So what I did for a while was I would just write it as normal, and then I'd go through and I'd just say search and replace. Every time there's 2 spaces, you do the same thing. Do you still do that? Yeah? No, it's hard. It's hard. So I have people on my team who do that. Now, for the students, I just tell them, just go to, find and replace and just fix it. Because you never have 2 spaces other than after a period, so you can just fix them all that are ultimately there. But first person is now allowed in academic writing. Of course, I don't know who you use. We use Turabian. Kate Turabian is kind of the favorite for American universities, and that's based on the Chicago Manual style, but you can also use APA. There's different, and I don't know what you use in Poland, or I don't know what you use in Germany, but the first person breakthrough, I don't think most people got the news of, because they're constantly writing, this author, no, just say I. Not a lot, but you can say it, but you don't have to always make it sound weird with this author. The author of this tome thinks so-and-so. Okay, so with writing too, and you gotta schedule time for writing and editing. Now, I actually, this is the Lord speaking to my heart right now, because I've written or co-written a dozen books and about 1,000 articles, of which probably 50 were academic. Maybe that's too high. Maybe 30. So I write a lot until recently, and I've really gotten. It's been actually I'm 5 years late on a book contract. So I recently asked InterVarsity Press, I said, am I the latest author that you've ever had? And they said, no, but you're getting close. I said, that's my goal. I want to be the latest author that has ever turned in a book. But so like right now, remember we had a come to Jesus meeting with my editor just recently. He said, I have to have your book by August. I said, okay. So then how do you do that? Right. So let's, again, quoting, assignment writing is a process which involves planning, drafting, and reviewing what you're going to say. You'll find you need to review your initial plan, edit as you go along. You'd expect to redraft sections of writing. So I've written, this book is on the future of evangelicalism, right? It's going to make some people mad. It's going to hopefully shed some light. It's going to be a mix. So I think I have 90% of the book done. And I say I think because right now my editor is going through and saying to me, this chapter is not ringing the bell. So you got to come back, because what happens is when you write something over and over and over again, but how do you do the scheduling? This is the most common question that I'm asked about writing, particularly when you're writing longer things. And what I have found other people do may be better for me to tell you than what I do. So what other people do is they tend to set, I'm going to write 1,000 words when you're in the draft stage. Sometimes editing 1,000 words is a lot more work than writing 1,000 words. But they'll find their pattern. I'm going to write 1,000 words, and I'm going to take 3 days a week to write 1,000 words each of those time, or maybe 500 words each of those time. And they block out the time when they're not distracted. They turn off their notifications on their computer, or they turn off the Wi-Fi in its entirety, and they just lean into it. Now, a lot of it depends upon kind of your personality. Are you able to focus for 6 hours writing? That's what I like to do. So what I tend to do is I tend to get away because I have a lot of employees with a lot of questions. I'm the dean of the 5th largest interdenominational seminary in the world, not even counting our undergrad program. So there's a lot of things that go on. So I got to kind of block it out. I got to say to my assistant who's in my email, you take care of this. We have 5 deans on the faculty. So they can all take care of this. So I've got to sort of block away large portions of time. So for me, writing and producing volumes is a break away and do it. But editing is, I can do editing 30 minutes, an hour at a time. Now again, one of the things that's hard for a lot of writers is they really love their words more than they should love their own words. I love my words, I guess, but I love an editor. And so all the time when I hire an editor, they're like, well, I don't want to change. I said, we literally have track changes. You edit, and if I don't like it, I'll say no. But you get a good editor. And most of the time, something I've published, I've edited 3 times, and editors edited a couple of times at the beginning and the end. Okay, so anyway, finding kind of your rhythm is I think real helpful. And again, the 3 editing tips to reduce word count. Go through a paragraph you've written, cross out any words, phrases, or sentence that may be unnecessary. I don't do that at first. I tend to gray it out. So again, reduction, and this is the part that's like Jason right now is doing on my stuff. It's reducing of the word count. So I have one chapter that has 11,000 words. Can't have a chapter that has 11. Well, in the way my books say, you could have a chapter that has 11. Nothing wrong with 11,000 words in a chapter. So, but again, you can see, have somebody, and in this case, I have an editor do it, but it might be you. Shrink it down, read it again if you lost anything, because we tend to communicate in ways that are redundant in speech. So we're sort of used to that, but it's not redundant in print. Replace phrases with single words meaning the same. The researcher wanted to find out blank. The researcher inquired. So one word replaces wanted to find out, which is more colloquial anyway. The researcher inquired. Cut down on larger amounts of word count. Try writing one sentence which sums up each paragraph. Read through it, rank the importance, take out the paragraphs that are the least important. I think that editing, in my view, and not just in my view, you can read people write about this, it is perhaps the most under-resourced opportunity, I think, because sometimes authors are insecure, sometimes authors love their own words too much and they don't communicate that they want to, but I want you also to know that I have told my editor, no, ultimately this is my work and my name. And most of the time when I overruled my editor, I regretted it later, but I have a good editor, so that makes a difference. So, write well by reading well. When we read academic writing and articles, we pick up ideas about how to write. So don't start writing academically without having read widely academically, because you don't have any frame of reference. So if you get a feel for how that works and how it's structured and things of that sort, it'll help you to be a better writer. Referencing is a key thing. Different studies and disciplines require referencing systems. Now, if you're a pastor, which I think some of you are, and you're going into academia, the standard for sermons is actually different than the standards for writing. Now, some might say the standards for sermons should be that, but the reality is that you'll sometimes say things in a sermon without citing the person in a way that you're not trying to hide or anything of that sort. So there are concepts. You might say, there's not one single inch in the human domain over which Jesus does not cry, this is mine. Well, I would probably say Kuyper, Kuyper says that. But you might say, let the nations be glad, and you might not cite John Piper in that, because, again, that kind of precedes him. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky. Sometimes people want to if you bring your level of what might be casual quotations, if you've ever said the gospel, how does Tim Keller put it? The way I say it is the gospel is not you do, the gospel is what Jesus did. Here's what Keller says. So you get up and say, all the religions in the world, if I obey, I'm accepted. I'm accepted, I obey in Christ. Do you cite Tim Keller on that every time? Probably people have nuanced and changed that a little bit, but the original source is probably Tim Keller. So preaching has a bit of a lower standard. I don't know whether that's always good, but otherwise we end up quoting as the commentary I read this week says, and you don't want to stand up, it's not like you're reading commentaries. But in this kind of stuff, it's a whole different world. And I will tell you, it is true that people from different cultures get in different kinds of trouble over their approach to citation. So in some cultures, citation is almost seen as like copying somebody's works is seen as a way to honor them. That is not an excuse because, I mean, it's true, but it's not an excuse. And I will tell you that almost every school has to fail each semester somebody, and then the message gets out that we take it seriously here. And it's heartbreaking. But this is why at the very beginning of class, we say, if in your cultural context, this is not true in academic writing. Okay, so, but they use different referencing styles. You can even find different assignments on a course use different styles. Again, I don't know what you would use in your context. These are all obviously American listed, but Chicago Manual has become globally used in so many cases. Build a well-defined document. Elements, here's some elements for a well-defined document. And that would include a clear thesis. What is it? Now, if you're writing it's different because, even articles have a thesis. I mean, the thesis on that article that I mentioned in the very beginning was that for a period of maybe 70 years, the primary way the gospel was spread were these wandering prophets who would come in and give prophetic words like we might see in the charismatic say with some differences. They would give prophetic words, and eventually those were sort of squeezed out because it was too kind of out there, and eventually the bishops took more control, and the rise of the monarchical episcopate. So that was my thesis. And then I tried to prove the thesis. Okay, but the thesis on a dissertation is pretty much what you see right at the beginning. You can look online, and almost everyone's thesis is listed publicly. You may have to buy. You got to get on, some of these dissertation services to get the whole thing. Develop an outline that's detailed yet flexible. Write an abstract of the article. Same thing. You could have multiple. Your chapters can have abstracts. Prepare an interesting introduction and conclusion. Keep in mind, interesting does not mean clever in academic writing or funny in academic writing. But it's something. Why would I want to read this? So in our note in the Cambridge Journal, it was just for 7 years, hundreds of doctoral dissertations have been using a code that has undercounted the fastest growing segment of Christian population. And that was interesting. Everybody read it after that. Lastly, seek helpful feedback. And I hate that you had to write that by yourself, but I think part of the challenge is, and nowadays, when I was writing my PhD dissertation, I was in a community of other scholars, and we actually read each other's dissertations, and that was good. That's less common today. Now it's pretty much you pay people to do that. And it's not super expensive, but when you're a student, it seems super expensive. But for me, it is worth it. Your professor, if you're doing a PhD dissertation, your professor should be your first line. But I will tell you, I have started reading and got one page into a dissertation and said, I've sent it back and said, you need to have this proofread. On more than one occasion. On one occasion, I said, you need to have this proofread by an English speaker, because clearly that had not been proofread by an English speaker. Another occasion, I said, you need to have this proofread because your thesis just it's not coming together. Have someone help you sharpen that. And actually, in that case, I said, I'm going to help sharpen your thesis. So we worked on that together. That wasn't me referring it back. But on several occasions, partly because I'm probably a difficult PhD supervisor, because I want these graduates to represent academic excellence in what they write. And so I have a high standard. I think right now there's a great devaluation of the PhD going on in American evangelicalism. And I've just taken over our PhD program, and we'll be actually raising our standards, not participating, and that's part of that helpful feedback. Just keep coming back to in maintaining academic integrity. It's just so key. I've seen so many lose a lot because they didn't take the time to do something right. And again, embrace perseverance. It's work. And my kids, I have 3 daughters. One has a master's degree in vocal performance, and so she didn't write a lot of papers. And so all 3 of my kids make fun of me because I'll be sitting at home and I'll be writing or editing, and I don't know, there'll be something that needs to get done in the house and I haven't done it. And one of my kids will say, "Dad, you really should do that." I say, "Well, I'm working." And they roll their eyes and say, "Typity, typity, type." So to them, typity, type is not really work. They just see dad, typity, type. But they know they got to take the trash out. It feels like real work. But it is real work. And the more you do it, probably the better you get at it. And finding your voice is part of that process as well. I actually found two voices, which is kind of strange. I have kind of a punchy, if you read my articles in USA Today, I write an article in USA, a popular article in USA Today, defending a university to be in what's called the Sweet 16 of the NCAA basketball championships. And I have a sentence in there that says, just let the religious kids play some basketball. Now, that's not something I'd ever write in an academic meeting, which is probably one of the most quoted articles in USA Today. Everyone kept quoting it because they were trying to kick out the school because they held these views about marriage that religious organizations tend to. And so just let the religious kids play some basketball. Again, so that's a different voice, but I kind of have a voice for public audience, maybe I have three. Public secular audience. I have a voice for kind of Christian audience. I wrote an article for CNN called Why Your Christian Friends Keep Inviting You to Church on Easter. And I said, let's face it, someone's going to invite you to church and it's going to feel weird. That's because it's the opening sentence of the article, right? So stuff like that is more of developing the voice, but that comes with a lot of experience. So write.